Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Arkansas. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested to know to what places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. In the autumn of 1887, local authorities in Washington County, Arkansas, were alerted to a peculiar and troubling situation. A small farmhouse on the outskirts of what was then known as Crow Hollow had been abandoned. This alone would not have warranted attention, as properties in the area were often left vacant when families moved westward seeking better fortune. What drew concern was not the absence of inhabitants, but rather what remained in their wake. The farmhouse belonged to the Blackwood family, who had settled there nearly 30 years prior. According to county records, the property had been purchased by Ezekiel Blackwood in 1858, shortly after his marriage to Martha Crowley, a woman from the neighboring county of Benton. The couple had 3 children: Samuel, the eldest son, born in 1859, Abigail, born in 1862, and Jeremiah, the youngest, born in 1868. The family was known to keep to themselves, with Ezekiel making only necessary trips into the nearby town of Fayetteville to sell crops and purchase supplies. A report filed by Sheriff Thomas Hargrove on October 15, 1887, described the abandoned Blackwood property as a place of profound disquiet. The farmhouse itself stood at the end of a narrow dirt path nearly a mile from the main road. The structure was modest, a 2-story wooden building with a small front porch and chimney. Behind the house stood a barn and several outbuildings. What captured immediate attention, however, was the garden. Located on the eastern side of the property, the garden occupied approximately 1 acre of land. Unlike the rest of the property, which had fallen into disrepair, the garden appeared meticulously maintained. Rows of plants stood in precise formation, though none were recognized by the sheriff as common crops or flowers. According to his report, the soil appeared unusually dark and rich compared to surrounding areas, despite the autumn season when most soil had dried considerably. The interior of the farmhouse presented an even more unsettling scene. While no signs of violence were evident, the careful arrangement of personal belongings suggested a planned departure rather than a hasty evacuation. Clothing remained folded in drawers. Dishes were stacked neatly in cabinets. The family Bible sat open on the kitchen table, though several pages appeared to have been removed. What struck Sheriff Hargrove as most peculiar was the discovery of small cloth pouches tucked into corners of each room, containing what his report described as soil samples of different composition and coloration, along with dried plant matter of unknown origin. The investigation might have ended there, dismissed as nothing more than the eccentricities of a reclusive family, had it not been for the arrival of Jacob Thorne, who identified himself as Martha Blackwood's cousin. Thorne had traveled from Missouri upon receiving a letter from Martha that suggested the family was in distress. Though he arrived too late to find them, he provided authorities with the letter, dated September 3, 1887. The letter, preserved in the county historical archives, contains several passages that hint at the mental state of Martha Blackwood in the weeks before the family's disappearance. "Ezekiel spends more time in the garden than with his family now," she wrote. "Something has changed in him since Samuel returned. The boys work from dawn until dusk, digging and planting, though what grows there brings no nourishment to our table. Abigail refuses to set foot beyond the porch steps. She says the ground moans when they dig, though I hear nothing but the wind." Martha's letter concluded with a plea for her cousin to visit, stating that she feared what might be harvested if this continues. This cryptic statement prompted Sheriff Hargrove to conduct a more thorough examination of the garden, though his subsequent report noted only that the soil appears to have been recently turned in several locations, with peculiar items buried at measured intervals. These items, mostly animal bones and curiously shaped stones, suggest a method of fertilization outside common agricultural practice. The case might have faded into obscurity had it not been for the discovery made by a land surveyor in the spring of 1888. While assessing the property for potential sale, the surveyor uncovered a hidden cellar beneath the barn floor. Unlike most root cellars common to farms of that era, this space appeared to have served a different purpose. The walls were covered with intricate drawings, detailed anatomical sketches of plants, animals, and what appeared to be human forms, though the latter were significantly distorted. A workbench along one wall held dozens of glass jars containing preserved specimens, labeled in a cramped, precise handwriting, later identified as Ezekiel Blackwood's. According to the surveyor's account, the most disturbing aspect of the cellar was not its contents, but rather the careful categorization system employed. Each jar, each drawing, each implement was numbered and cross-referenced in a ledger found on the workbench. The final pages of this ledger contained calculations and projections related to soil composition, sunlight exposure, and growth rates, all common elements of agricultural planning, yet applied with a precision that suggested scientific experimentation rather than farming. The ledger made frequent references to transference of essence and hereditary acceleration, terms that meant little to local authorities but raised concern when reviewed by a professor from the university in Fayetteville. In his assessment, documented in the case files, the professor suggested that Ezekiel Blackwood had been attempting to create a new method of cultivation, one that incorporated elements of both botany and animal husbandry in ways that defied conventional understanding. The disappearance of the Blackwood family remained unexplained, though records from a train station in Fort Smith, approximately 60 miles southwest of Crow Hollow, indicated that tickets for westbound passage had been purchased on September the 25th, 1887, by individuals matching the description of Ezekiel and Martha. No mention was made of the children in these records. As spring turned to summer in 1888, the Blackwood property remained vacant, the garden untended. Locals reported avoiding the area, citing an unnatural silence that seemed to envelop the property. No bird song, no insect noise, nothing but the occasional rustle of wind through the now overgrown garden plants. The county attempted to auction the property, but no buyers came forward, deterred by rumors that had begun to circulate about the strange garden and its even stranger caretaker. In July of that year, a fire of unknown origin consumed the farmhouse. By the time neighboring farmers noticed the blaze and arrived to help, nothing remained but smoldering ruins. Curiously, the garden remained untouched by the flames, despite their proximity. The barn and cellar survived as well, though the entrance to the latter was sealed by county officials, citing safety concerns. For several years, the property remained abandoned, the garden gradually reclaimed by the natural vegetation of the Ozark foothills. The case might have ended there, relegated to local legend, had it not been for the arrival of Edgar Blackwood in 1892. Identifying himself as Ezekiel's brother from Pennsylvania, Edgar presented documentation proving his legal right to claim the property in his brother's absence. Edgar Blackwood was described by those who met him as a scholarly man, slight of build, with the same intense gaze that had characterized his brother. Unlike Ezekiel, however, Edgar was sociable, frequenting establishments in Fayetteville and engaging locals in conversations about the area's history and agricultural practices. He seemed particularly interested in the garden his brother had maintained, asking detailed questions about what had grown there and how the locals had perceived it. Within months of his arrival, Edgar had constructed a new, smaller dwelling on the property and had begun to restore the garden. Those who observed his work noted that he followed what appeared to be a map or diagram, carefully measuring distances between planting sites and testing soil from different areas of the property. When questioned about his intentions, Edgar explained that he was continuing his brother's work in developing hardier crop strains, an explanation that satisfied most inquiries. What few knew was that Edgar had reopened the sealed cellar and had spent hours studying the materials left behind by his brother. According to journals later discovered, Edgar had been in correspondence with Ezekiel for years, sharing theories and experimental results related to their mutual interest in what they termed biological inheritance patterns in cultivated specimens. Edgar's presence in Crow Hollow might have remained unremarkable had it not been for the series of disappearances that began in the spring of 1893. The first to vanish was Thomas Reed, a local farmhand who had been hired by Edgar to assist with heavy labor on the property. Reed was last seen entering the barn on April 12, 1893. When questioned, Edgar stated that he had paid Reed for his work that day and the man had left before sundown. No trace of Reed was ever found. Over the next several months, 3 more individuals disappeared from areas near the Blackwood property: a traveling salesman who had stopped to rest his horses near the property line, a young woman who had been gathering herbs in the woods adjacent to the farm, and a child from a neighboring homestead who had wandered away while playing. Though no direct connection could be established between these disappearances and Edgar Blackwood, suspicion began to mount among the local population. In September of 1893, Sheriff William Donovan, who had succeeded Thomas Hargrove, conducted an inspection of the Blackwood property. His report indicated nothing overtly suspicious, though he noted that the garden now contained specimens unlike any cultivated in this region, with blooms of unusual coloration and structural abnormalities in leaf and stem formation. Edgar explained these as experimental hybrids, part of his work to develop plants resistant to drought and pests. The sheriff might have accepted this explanation had he not noticed a peculiar detail during his inspection. The soil in certain parts of the garden contained fragments of what appeared to be bone. When questioned, Edgar dismissed these as animal remains used for fertilizer, a common practice among farmers of the era. Sheriff Donovan, uncomfortable but lacking evidence of wrongdoing, departed with a warning to Edgar to keep his experimental gardening practices within acceptable boundaries. 2 weeks later, on October 7, 1893, a storm of unusual intensity struck the region. Lightning struck the Blackwood barn, igniting a fire that spread rapidly. By morning, the barn was destroyed, exposing the entrance to the cellar below. What local authorities found inside would become the foundation for one of the most disturbing investigations in Washington County history. The cellar, expanded considerably since its initial discovery, now contained an elaborate laboratory setup. Glass containers lined shelves along the walls, each containing plant specimens in various stages of growth, suspended not in water, as might be expected, but in a thick amber-colored fluid. Detailed journals documented experiments conducted over the previous year, with precise measurements and observations recorded in Edgar's meticulous handwriting. Most disturbing were the drawings that covered one wall of the cellar, detailed anatomical sketches showing what appeared to be attempts to graft plant structures onto animal forms. Notes in the margins described success in tissue integration and promising signs of crossover properties. Several entries referred to human subjects, though in clinical, detached language, that suggested Edgar viewed such experiments as merely extensions of his work with plants and animals. No human remains were found in the cellar or on the property, despite an extensive search conducted by county authorities. Edgar Blackwood himself was nowhere to be found, though his personal belongings remained in the house, suggesting he had not planned a departure. A journal entry dated October 6, 1893, the day before the storm, indicated that he had been preparing for the final phase of integration, as outlined in my brother's original thesis. The investigation that followed uncovered a web of correspondence between Edgar and individuals at various scientific institutions throughout the eastern United States. These letters, seized from a locked drawer in Edgar's desk, revealed that the Blackwood brothers had been engaged in a field of research considered radical, even among progressive scientific circles of the time: the exploration of cross-species biological integration, or what one letter referred to as the dissolution of boundaries between plant and animal kingdoms. Several of these correspondents expressed ethical concerns about the brothers' methods, particularly regarding Edgar's references to human applications. One letter, dated June 1893, from a professor at a medical college in Philadelphia, explicitly severed their professional relationship, stating that while the theoretical framework of your work has merit, the practical applications you describe cross boundaries of natural law and human decency that no scientific advancement can justify. As authorities pieced together the activities of Edgar Blackwood, they were forced to consider a disturbing possibility that the disappearances in the area might be connected to his experiments. This suspicion gained weight when a search of the garden revealed areas where the soil composition matched samples found in the cellar, suggesting that whatever had been cultivated in the laboratory had also been transferred to the outdoor garden. By November of 1893, the case had attracted attention beyond Washington County. A representative from the state governor's office arrived to oversee the investigation, bringing with him a specialist described in official records only as Dr. Wilson, an expert in matters of unusual scientific inquiry. Dr. Wilson spent several days examining the Cellar laboratory and garden, collecting samples, and reviewing the Blackwood journals. His final assessment, submitted to both county and state officials, has been largely redacted in publicly available records, though fragments suggest he considered the Blackwood experiments a perversion of natural science toward ends that defy categorization within existing frameworks of botanical or zoological understanding. Throughout the winter of 1893 and into early 1894, searches for Edgar Blackwood and the missing locals continued without success. The garden, now under official scrutiny, was systematically excavated. According to records from the county clerk's office, these excavations yielded specimens of indeterminate classification, possessing characteristics of both plant and animal origin. These specimens were reportedly sent to a state facility for further examination, though no records of their arrival or subsequent analysis have been found in state archives. In February of 1894, the investigation took an unexpected turn with the arrival of Samuel Blackwood, Ezekiel's eldest son, who had been presumed missing along with the rest of the family. Now 35 years old, Samuel appeared at the sheriff's office in Fayetteville, offering to provide information about his father's work and his uncle's continuation of it. According to transcripts of his interview, Samuel had left the family home in 1885 after a profound disagreement with his father regarding the direction of their agricultural experiments. Father began with noble intentions, Samuel stated. He sought only to create hardier crops that could withstand the harsh conditions many farmers faced. But after Mother's illness in 1882, something changed in him. He became fixated on the idea that the boundary between life forms was more permeable than science recognized, that qualities from one living thing could be transferred to another through proper cultivation. Samuel described how his father had progressed from crossbreeding plants to more radical experiments, eventually incorporating animal matter into his soil mixtures. He believed that soil was not merely a medium for growth, but a conduit for transference of essence, Samuel explained. By 1885, he had begun experimenting with bone meal from different animals, claiming he could detect subtle differences in the resulting plants: hardiness from cattle bones, rapid growth from rabbit remains, resistance to blight from particular wild birds. When asked about his siblings, Samuel's account grew more hesitant. He confirmed that his brother Jeremiah had remained at the farm, becoming increasingly involved in their father's work. Abigail, he claimed, had been sent to live with relatives in Missouri in 1886, though he had lost contact with her and could not provide their location. When pressed about his parents' whereabouts, Samuel stated only that they had traveled west, seeking new territory for their work, after local conditions had proven insufficient for their purposes. Most significantly, Samuel provided context for Edgar's involvement. Uncle Edgar was always the theorist, while Father was the practitioner, he explained. They exchanged ideas for years. But Uncle believed Father moved too slowly, was too cautious in his applications. When I returned briefly in 1887 to warn them about Edgar's intentions, I found Father had already embraced methods I considered dangerous. The garden had become something unrecognizable, and Jeremiah had been transformed by his participation in the work. This reference to Jeremiah's transformation was not elaborated upon in the transcript, though a note from Sheriff Donovan indicated that Samuel became agitated when pressed on this point and refused to provide further details. Samuel did, however, offer a disturbing theory about the missing persons around Crow Hollow. Uncle Edgar's methods would have required fresh material for his integration experiments, he stated, not merely animals, as Father had used, but something more complex, something closer to the target form he sought to create. When asked directly if he was suggesting that Edgar had used human remains in his experiments, Samuel neither confirmed nor denied the accusation, stating only that the garden requires specific nutrients to yield its particular harvest. Uncle would have been meticulous about providing exactly what was needed, regardless of the source. Following his interview, Samuel agreed to accompany authorities to the Blackwood property to identify specific areas of concern. According to Sheriff Donovan's report, Samuel became visibly distressed upon seeing the current state of the garden, noting that certain plants had grown far beyond what should have been possible in the time since his uncle's disappearance. In areas Samuel identified, at depths of 3 to 5 feet, excavators discovered what official reports described only as organic matter of complex composition. A physician brought from Fayetteville to examine these findings concluded that they contained elements consistent with human tissue, though substantially altered in structure and incorporated with plant root systems in a manner that defies medical explanation. No complete human remains were found, supporting Samuel's claim that his uncle's methods involved complete integration rather than simple burial. This lack of identifiable remains complicated the investigation, as charges could not be filed without clear evidence of victims. He directed the excavation team to several locations where he believed integration experiments had been conducted. These excavations, conducted in March of 1894, yielded the most disturbing findings of the investigation. Samuel himself was held for questioning, but eventually released, due to lack of evidence linking him directly to either his uncle's experiments or the disappearances. In April of 1894, county officials made the decision to destroy the garden entirely. The area was doused with coal oil and burned, the ashes plowed under, and the soil treated with lime. The Cellar laboratory was emptied of all equipment and sealed permanently. The entrance collapsed and covered. The Blackwood property was declared uninhabitable and barred from future sale or occupation. Samuel Blackwood left Fayetteville shortly after the investigation concluded, reportedly traveling to California. No record of his subsequent activities has been found in available archives, though a passenger manifest from a steamship company in San Francisco lists a S. Blackwood departing for ports in Southeast Asia in December of 1894. For several years, the Blackwood property remained untouched, avoided by locals who now referred to the area as the Witch's Garden, despite no evidence of supernatural activities. In the summer of 1897, a survey team from the county assessor's office reported that despite efforts to neutralize the soil, unusual plant growth had begun to recur in the former garden area, with specimens described as structural anomalies, possessing characteristics not consistent with known regional flora. A second burning was ordered, more thorough than the first. Afterward, the county arranged for large quantities of rock and gravel to be dumped over the garden area, effectively burying it under several feet of non-organic material. This appears to have been successful in preventing further growth, as subsequent reports mention no unusual vegetation at the site. The mystery of Edgar Blackwood's disappearance might have remained unsolved had it not been for a discovery made by hunters in the Ozark Mountains, approximately 20 miles east of the former Blackwood property, in October of 1897. In a remote valley accessible only by a narrow trail, the hunters found what they initially thought to be an unusual stand of vegetation, tall, fibrous growths, unlike typical trees or shrubs of the region. Upon closer inspection, they realized with horror that these were not plants in any conventional sense. According to their account given to Sheriff Donovan on October 23, 1897, the growths possessed features reminiscent of human form, limb-like protrusions, trunk-like central masses, and most disturbingly, structures that resembled faces, frozen in expressions the hunters described as anguished. When authorities reached the location guided by the hunters, they found the site already altered. Most of the unusual growths had been cut down and burned, with only charred stumps and ash remaining. Evidence suggested this had occurred recently, perhaps only days before. Among the ashes, investigators found a pocket watch later identified as belonging to Edgar Blackwood, along with fragments of clothing consistent with items known to have been in his possession. Most significant was the discovery of a small leather journal, partially burned, but with many pages still legible. These entries documented his escape during the storm, his establishment of a new experimental site in the remote valley, and the progress of what he termed the final integration phase. The journal's later entries become increasingly erratic, with references to successful germination of human-plant hybrids and unexpected mobility in mature specimens. The final entry, dated September 30, 1897, contains only a short passage. They are fully autonomous now, no longer requiring my guidance. The handwriting matched Edgar's, with entries dating from October 1893 through September 1897. What began as scientific inquiry has yielded something beyond my control. Jeremiah was right. Once the boundaries crossed, there is no return to separation. I fear I have become unnecessary to their continuation. Whether Edgar Blackwood fell victim to his own creations, as this entry might suggest, or whether he destroyed his experiments and fled, remains unknown. No trace of him was ever found beyond the items at the burn site. Similarly, no conclusive evidence regarding the fate of Jeremiah Blackwood was ever discovered, though Samuel's earlier testimony suggested he had somehow been incorporated into his father's work years earlier. A final, curious footnote to the case emerged in December of 1897, when the county clerk's office received a letter postmarked from San Francisco. Written in a feminine hand and signed simply A.B., the letter inquired about the status of the Blackwood property and whether any family members had returned to claim it. The letter contained a pressed flower, a species unidentifiable by local experts, and a request that if anyone named Blackwood should appear, they should be given a message. The garden grows differently here, but the seeds remain the same. County officials connecting the initials to Abigail Blackwood responded with a brief account of the property's status and requested further information about the sender's identity and knowledge of the Blackwood family's activities. No reply was ever received, and the pressed flower was reportedly destroyed after it began to exhibit unusual changes in coloration and structure while in storage. With the main investigation concluded and the Blackwood property secured against further use, the case might have faded from public consciousness. However, local oral histories collected by the County Historical Society in the 1920s and 1930s reveal that the legacy of the witch's garden persisted in regional memory for decades, influencing local agricultural practices and folk beliefs about proper and improper cultivation methods. Several accounts describe how farmers in Washington County developed specific rituals when planting crops following the Blackwood incident. Soil was never mixed with animal remains, no matter how beneficial such practices might be for fertilization. Gardens were always planted in straight rows rather than the circular patterns reportedly used by the Blackwoods, and certain combinations of plants were avoided, not for agricultural reasons, but due to superstitions about unnatural pairings. Perhaps most telling is the tradition, documented in several family histories from the region, of speaking to newly planted crops not as a form of superstition, but as a way of establishing a boundary between cultivator and cultivated. My grandfather always told us to remind the plants who was tending and who was growing, stated one account from 1932. He said the Blackwoods had forgotten that distinction, and that was where their troubles began. The physical evidence of the Blackwood experiments has largely been lost to time. The property remained under county control until 1915, when changes to property laws allowed it to be sold at auction. The buyer, a timber company with no knowledge of the property's history, harvested the surrounding forest but left the central area untouched due to lack of viable timber. The land changed hands several times over subsequent decades, though local sentiment ensured that no residential construction occurred on the site of the former garden. What remains are the documents, the sheriff's reports, the fragments of the Blackwood journals, the correspondence between the brothers and their scientific contacts. These materials, stored in the county archives, provide a window into a disturbing chapter of regional history, one that blurs the line between scientific innovation and moral transgression. The final known reference to the Blackwood case in official records comes from a report filed by a county surveyor in 1899 who had been tasked with updating property maps for the region. His notes on the Blackwood property are brief but telling. Land remains vacant. Former garden area covered with gravel as per county directive. No unusual vegetation observed. Soil samples from perimeter show normal composition. Recommend continued monitoring of site at 5-year intervals. Whether these recommended inspections were ever conducted is unclear from available records, as is the question of whether the Blackwood experiments truly ended with the destruction of the garden and the disappearance of Edgar Blackwood. The remote valley where the hunters made their disturbing discovery was never settled, eventually being incorporated into what would become the Ozark National Forest in the early 20th century. If any trace of Edgar's final work remained, it would have been obscured by decades of natural growth and minimal human intrusion. The scientific principles behind the Blackwood experiments remain as unclear today as they were to the authorities who investigated the case. The journals and correspondence, while suggesting a coherent theoretical framework, employ terminology and concepts that do not align with either the scientific understanding of their time or our current knowledge of genetics and botanical hybridization. Whether the Blackwoods had stumbled upon principles unknown to conventional science, or whether their work was founded on fundamental misunderstandings of natural processes, cannot be determined from the available evidence. What is certain is that the case deeply affected those who encountered it directly. Sheriff Donovan, who led the final phase of the investigation, requested transfer to another county in 1900, citing in his resignation letter persistent disturbances of sleep resulting from matters encountered during the Blackwood investigation. The physician who examined the excavated materials from the garden reportedly abandoned his medical practice shortly afterward, taking a position as a clerk in a dry goods store until his death in 1912. Samuel Blackwood, the only family member to return and provide testimony, vanishes from historical record after his departure for California. No death certificate or census record has been found for him under that name, suggesting either that he lived his remaining years under an assumed identity or that records of his later life have been lost or deliberately obscured. The fate of Abigail Blackwood, if indeed she was the A.B. who sent the letter from San Francisco, remains equally mysterious. County marriage records for California show no entry for an Abigail Blackwood during the relevant period, nor do cemetery records in the San Francisco area. If she established a new life there, she did so without leaving conventional historical traces. As for Jeremiah, the youngest Blackwood son, Samuel's cryptic reference to his transformation provides the only clue to his fate. If, as Samuel suggested, Jeremiah had become somehow incorporated into his father's work, the nature of this incorporation, whether as active participant, unwilling subject, or something more disturbing, remains one of the most unsettling aspects of the case. Ezekiel and Martha Blackwood, who reportedly traveled west after abandoning the original farm, similarly disappear from historical record. No land purchases, census entries, or death records have been found under their names in Western territories or states. They may have changed their identities, lived in isolation beyond the reach of official documentation, or met fates similar to those that apparently befell Edgar Blackwood in the remote Ozark Valley. In the absence of conclusive evidence, the Blackwood case has inspired numerous theories and interpretations over the years. Some analysts have suggested that the entire affair was a manifestation of mass hysteria fueled by rural isolation and suspicion of scientific practices beyond local understanding. Others have proposed that the Blackwoods were engaged in early crude experiments in what would later develop into genetic engineering, working from intuitive understanding rather than formal scientific knowledge. A particularly persistent interpretation, especially among those interested in the history of alternative agricultural practices, is that the Blackwoods had developed a form of intensive biodynamic farming that incorporated principles of what would now be called permaculture, the integration of animal and plant systems in mutually supportive relationships. In this view, the more disturbing aspects of the case represent misunderstandings or deliberate exaggerations by authorities uncomfortable with methods that challenged conventional agricultural wisdom of the time. What none of these interpretations adequately address is the physical evidence reportedly found during the investigation, the strange laboratory specimens, the altered plant forms, and, most significantly, the human-plant hybrid growths discovered in the remote valley. If the accounts of these findings are accurate, they suggest something beyond either hysteria or misunderstood agricultural innovation. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Blackwood case is not what was discovered, but what might remain undiscovered. The journal entries referring to autonomous creations, no longer requiring their creators' guidance, imply a legacy that could have continued beyond the events documented in the official investigation. The remote valleys and dense forests of the Ozarks contain countless isolated areas where unusual growth might persist unnoticed for generations. Local legends from the early 20th century occasionally reference sightings of walking trees or rooted men in the deepest parts of the Ozark wilderness. These accounts, dismissed as folk tales by outside observers, take on a more unsettling quality when viewed in light of the Blackwood case. If Edgar's final experiments achieved the autonomy he described, what form might their continuation have taken in the decades since? Contemporary hikers and naturalists in the Ozark National Forest sometimes report unusual vegetation in remote areas, plants with structural abnormalities, unexpected coloration, or growth patterns that defy conventional botanical classification. These reports are typically attributed to natural mutations, environmental factors, or misidentification by inexperienced observers. The possibility of a connection to experiments conducted over a century ago is rarely considered outside of local folklore. In 1972, a botany student conducting field research in the Ozarks collected samples of what appeared to be a previously undocumented plant species. The specimens exhibited unusual cellular structures that, according to the student's notes, suggest characteristics of both plant and animal tissue, particularly in vascular and connective elements. Before these findings could be published or verified, however, the student's research materials were reportedly destroyed in a laboratory fire, and the research was never completed. This incident, while not definitively linked to the Blackwood case, echoes elements of the original investigation in ways that are difficult to dismiss as coincidental. The student's field notes, partially preserved in university archives, indicate that the collection site was within 10 miles of the valley where Edgar Blackwood's final experimental location had been discovered in 1897. What remains of the Blackwood legacy today? The original property, now privately owned, bears no marker or monument to indicate its historical significance. The gravel covering placed over the garden area in 1897 has long since been incorporated into the soil through natural processes, though local lore suggests that even now, nothing grows quite normally in that particular spot. The location of Edgar's remote valley laboratory, never precisely documented in official records, has been lost to collective memory, indistinguishable from countless similar valleys in the expansive Ozark wilderness. The documentary evidence, the reports, journals, and correspondence remains preserved in county archives, accessible to researchers, but rarely requested or reviewed. The case occasionally appears as a footnote in academic works on 19th century agricultural experimentation or regional folklore, typically framed as an example of rural superstition or misunderstood scientific practice, rather than as a genuine mystery with potentially disturbing implications. Perhaps this obscurity is for the best. The Blackwood experiments, whatever their true nature, represented a transgression of boundaries between species, between natural and artificial, between cultivation and creation. In a world increasingly comfortable with the manipulation of living systems through genetic engineering and synthetic biology, the crude yet effective methods reportedly developed by the Blackwoods serve as a reminder that innovation without ethical constraint can yield results as disturbing as they are remarkable. For those who encounter the story today, the Witch's Garden of Crow Hollow stands as a caution, a reminder that the line between nurturing life and fundamentally altering it can be crossed almost imperceptibly, one careful cultivation at a time. In the words attributed to Samuel Blackwood during his testimony, the garden always reveals the gardener's true intent, no matter what name he gives to his work. Visitors to Washington County today will find no official acknowledgement of the Blackwood case. The area once known as Crow Hollow has been absorbed into the expanding boundaries of Fayetteville, the rural landscape transformed by development. Yet even now, local residents sometimes mention that certain areas remain strangely resistant to cultivation, with plants that never quite thrive and soil that never quite yields as it should. Some attribute this to changes in climate or soil composition over the decades. Others, particularly those whose families have lived in the region for generations, offer a different explanation, that some things, once planted, can never truly be uprooted. They speak of the Blackwood Garden not as historical curiosity, but as ongoing presence, its influence spreading underground through root systems and soil exchanges that no gravel barrier could permanently contain. Whether these beliefs represent the persistence of folklore or intuitive recognition of an uncomfortable truth is a question each visitor must answer for themselves. What is certain is that the boundaries between different forms of life, boundaries the Blackwoods allegedly sought to dissolve, remain more permeable than conventional science might suggest. In 1895, a letter was discovered among the effects of a recently deceased physician in Fayetteville, addressed to a colleague at a medical college in the East. The letter, never sent, contained a disturbing observation about tissue samples taken from the Blackwood Garden during the investigation. Under microscopic examination, the cellular structures appear to be actively changing, even days after removal from their growth medium. I have observed what can only be described as a reconfiguration of basic cellular architecture, with plant cells developing structures reminiscent of animal tissue and vice versa. Most disturbing is the apparent intentionality of these changes. They do not present as random mutations, but as directed adaptations. I cannot escape the unsettling conclusion that whatever process the Blackwoods initiated continues independent of their guidance. This letter was reportedly filed away by county officials and never included in the official case records. Whether this represents an attempt to suppress disturbing evidence or simply administrative oversight cannot be determined from available documentation. Throughout the early 20th century, farmers in areas surrounding the former Blackwood property occasionally reported unusual phenomena in their fields and gardens: plants that moved in the absence of wind, root systems that appeared to form patterns resembling written characters, crops that, when harvested, revealed internal structures unlike anything previously documented in those species. These reports, collected by a local folklorist in 1938, were generally dismissed as superstition or exaggeration by county authorities. The folklorist, whose work was never formally published, noted a geographical pattern to these reports. They occurred most frequently along what would have been natural drainage routes leading from the former Blackwood property, suggesting that whatever had been cultivated there might have spread through soil and water systems to surrounding areas over the decades. In the spring of 1898, nearly 6 months after the burning of Edgar Blackwood's remote valley laboratory, hunters in the area reported finding unusual animal remains in the vicinity. According to their accounts, these animals, primarily deer and small mammals, exhibited what appeared to be plant-like structures growing from wounds or natural body openings. County officials, perhaps wary of reviving public concern about the Blackwood case, conducted a cursory investigation and attributed the findings to natural decomposition processes and the growth of fungi or mold on the remains. A more troubling report emerged from a trapper who claimed to have encountered a living deer with what he described as shoots or stems emerging from its flanks, green and leaf-bearing like new plant growth. The trapper's account was documented by the local newspaper but treated as a curiosity rather than cause for alarm. No physical evidence was presented to support the claim, and subsequent searches of the area yielded no similar specimens. These accounts, while inconclusive, suggest that the effects of the Blackwood experiments may have extended into the local ecosystem in ways that the official investigation failed to fully document or address. If the integration of plant and animal characteristics was indeed achieved, as the evidence suggests, the potential for such adaptations to spread through natural reproduction or cross-contamination presents a disturbing possibility that the Blackwood legacy continues not merely as legend, but as living presence in the remote corners of the Ozark wilderness. The Blackwood case remains unique in documented history, a singular example of experimentation at the boundaries of biological classification, conducted outside institutional oversight and driven by ambitions that transcended conventional agricultural or scientific goals. Whether viewed as cautionary tale, historical curiosity, or genuinely disturbing possibility, it represents a chapter in regional history that resists comfortable categorization or dismissal. For those drawn to investigate such matters, a word of caution may be appropriate. Some boundaries exist for reason, and some knowledge carries consequences beyond intellectual satisfaction. The garden, as the saying goes, always reveals the gardener's true intent, but it may also transform the gardener in ways that were never intended. In the silence of remote valleys and the fertile soil of forgotten places, some harvests continue long after the last seed was planted.